It begins not with the sound of battle, but with the faint hum of a lamp over an old wooden desk. A gloved hand opens a file marked in faded ink. H. Himmler, personal correspondence. The paper is yellowed, the type faint, yet every line is unnervingly precise. Lists, meeting notes, memoranda, signatures repeated with mechanical grace. To an untrained eye, it could pass for the daily paperwork of a government office. But between the sterile lines lies something more sinister, the machinery of a mind that turned order into an instrument of cruelty. Historians discovered this file buried deep within post-war archives, its contents rarely shown to the public. They describe it as the anatomy of obedience, a chilling map of how a man can construct horror without ever raising his voice. The narrator speaks slowly, each word measured. He never killed anyone with his hands, yet his pen condemned millions. The sentence lingers, not as accusation, but as puzzle. What happens when the greatest crime in history is executed by routine? Viewer discretion is advised. This content is educational and based on historical records. The camera drifts across the pages, dates, names, locations, an ecosystem of signatures feeding into silence. Every page testifies not to rage, but to procedure, and that is where the terror hides. Himmler's world was not built on passion, but precision, a place where bureaucracy itself became the perfect weapon. As the folder closes, the hum of the lamp fades into the quiet rhythm of a typewriter beginning again. The story of the bureaucrat of evil has begun. Heinrich Himmler was not born to power. He was a frail boy from Munich, fascinated by discipline, obsessed with notebooks and order. He collected data about weather and plants before he ever studied politics. His handwriting, round, careful, and symmetrical, hinted at a personality shaped by rules. Friends remembered him as polite, almost shy. He avoided confrontation, disliked noise, and often corrected others' grammar. There was nothing monstrous in his manner. Yet in the photograph that history remembers, he stands rigid in black, a symbol of mechanical authority. Historians describe this contradiction as one of the 20th century's darkest revelations, that evil can wear the mask of normality. The man who orchestrated one of the most chilling systems of control in modern history believed he was maintaining order. He wrote to his wife about herbal medicine and household budgets while issuing directives that defined the fate of millions. To understand Himmler, one must abandon the idea of madness. His cruelty was never spontaneous. It was methodical. It lived in the belief that the world could be cleansed by organization. He once told an officer, "We do not act in anger, but in duty." That phrase captures the poison at the heart of the modern age, the illusion that morality can be replaced by efficiency. As the narration slows, we glimpse his diary entries filled with trivial details about diet and sleep, placed beside orders that changed history. The paradox becomes unbearable. A man who sought harmony in his garden, but chaos in his ideology. The more we study him, the more terrifying the ordinariness becomes. Before uniforms, ranks, and parades, Himmler stood at the front of a small classroom. He dreamed of becoming a teacher, a man of structure and discipline who could shape young minds. But the post-war Germany of the 1920s offered little for dreamers. Inflation, humiliation, and political unrest created a generation hungry for certainty. Himmler found his in nationalist movements that promised revival through obedience. He was drawn not by violence, but by the promise of order. When he first encountered the ideas that would define his life, he treated them like scientific formulas, something to be tested, refined, and applied. His notes from that period reveal a fascination with hierarchy, purity, and self-control. Every emotion, he believed, could be mastered. Every weakness corrected. It was a philosophy of cold perfection. By the time he joined the SS, his ideals had hardened into doctrine. He saw himself not as a soldier, but as an engineer of morality. To him, loyalty was science and faith was administration. His transformation was quiet, but complete. The teacher had become a designer of ideology, convinced that humanity's flaws could be managed like statistics. Historians believe this was his most dangerous illusion, that evil could be rational and goodness could be engineered. The narrator's voice lowers as archival footage fades in. Young men marching in symmetrical lines, notebooks in hand, eyes fixed forward. They do not yet know that the lessons they follow will rewrite the moral architecture of a century. Himmler stands among them, calm, efficient, already certain that order alone can save the world. In 1929, the Schutzstaffel was little more than a ceremonial guard, a minor branch within the rising movement of the regime. Under Himmler, it became something entirely different. An organism built not on chaos, but on order. He envisioned it as the embodiment of purity and obedience, a society within a society. He wrote that the SS should be a community of men bound by faith and blood. But what he meant was a machine that erased individuality. Every uniform was tailored to the same measurement, every salute timed to the same beat, every ritual calculated to remind men that they were part of something greater and colder than themselves. Himmler's genius was in transforming ideology into routine. He replaced emotion with ceremony, belief with repetition. Every oath was memorized, every command recorded, every deviation punished not by rage, but by paperwork. The men who joined thought they were becoming elite warriors. But in truth, they were entering an experiment, one that measured how far obedience could reach when dressed as virtue. Historians describe this transformation as the birth of the bureaucratic conscience. No one in the SS acted from impulse. They acted from instruction. Himmler had found a way to sanctify obedience. It was no longer a military trait, but a spiritual one. The result was an organization that worshipped order as holiness. In the dim halls of training academies, recruits were taught that purity was not love, but structure. That to question was to betray. This was the foundation of a system that would later claim to act without hatred, yet without mercy. The SS had been born not as a weapon of war, but as a moral equation, cold, perfect, and deadly in its logic. While others in the regime fought for attention, Himmler moved in silence. His power did not come from charisma or speeches, but from files, forms, and folders. He understood that control did not require visibility, only documentation. He built a network of departments, each one reporting to another, creating a web of dependency that led back to him. No one saw the whole picture except the man behind the desk. Every report that crossed his office was read, annotated, and archived with obsessive precision. Witnesses recalled how he could recall the contents of a memo written years earlier, down to its exact phrasing. In his world, knowledge was power, and power meant possession of paper. The system he designed gave him omnipresence without exposure. He could act through others, shaping their choices with invisible threads of authority. Historians call this the perfection of bureaucratic control, the ability to command without ever appearing to do so. Himmler rarely raised his voice, yet his silence carried further than any shout. Even his subordinates feared not his anger, but his memory. His leadership was built on procedure, his morality on hierarchy. The danger of such a system is not in its violence, but in its precision. When rules replace judgment, evil becomes automatic. In the candlelit rooms of his headquarters, Himmler spoke often about the beauty of discipline. He believed that the state could become a living organism, each cell obeying without question. He did not want to destroy chaos by force. He wanted to out-document it. And in doing so, he created a world where paper outweighed conscience, and silence became the language of control. What transforms an ordinary man into the executor of a regime's darkest ambitions? The question hangs over Himmler's legacy like a shadow that never fades. Historians debate whether he was corrupted by ideology or whether he constructed ideology to justify his hunger for order. The truth may be that both paths led to the same end. He was not driven by hatred, at least not in the way others were. His cruelty was intellectual, not emotional. He believed that the world could be purified through systems, that sin could be erased by structure. Every document he signed carried the conviction that he was fixing, not destroying. It is this conviction that terrifies scholars even now, because it shows how morality can be inverted through reason. When Himmler looked at chaos, he did not see human suffering. He saw inefficiency. He dreamed of a civilization without friction, where everything functioned according to rule. In his mind, this was perfection. But perfection without compassion becomes tyranny by design. The narrator pauses as the camera moves over rows of file cabinets, stretching into darkness. Each drawer represents a life, reduced to a line of ink. The question returns. Could he have known what his system would unleash? Or was knowledge irrelevant once the mechanism was built? The horror of Himmler's world lies not in madness, but in method. Evil had become a process, one that required no anger, no malice, only a steady hand and a pen. And as historians trace his handwriting through the archives, they find not just evidence, but reflection. The deeper they look, the more the mirror turns toward us. By 1934, the machine Himmler had envisioned was fully in motion. What had begun as a small core of loyal followers had evolved into a vast administrative organism, cold, precise, and self-reinforcing. Each man within it followed his duty without hesitation. Each order flowed downward with the clarity of natural law. Historians describe it as one of the most efficient bureaucracies in modern history, not because of its size, but because of its psychology. Its members believed that obedience itself was moral. In Himmler's offices, silence replaced debate. The language of conscience was rewritten into procedural codes and memoranda. He did not need to threaten those who served him. The system threatened them on his behalf. Promotion came through conformity, survival through invisibility. The men who once swore loyalty to an idea now swore loyalty to a process. Inside this mechanism, questions vanished, replaced by the comfort of precision. The paper trail became a sacred ritual, each document stamped, signed, and archived with reverence. Orders were written in language so neutral that even horror could appear rational. This was not chaos. It was calculation. Himmler often said that a perfect order required perfect obedience. He believed that the will of the state was purer than any individual conscience. That belief became the fuel that powered the machine. Beneath the hum of typewriters and the shuffle of papers, a quiet catastrophe unfolded. The birth of a world where morality was no longer felt, only administered. And in that world, evil no longer looked like rage. It looked like paperwork being done correctly. Within the walls of SS academies, Obedience was no longer taught as a rule, but as a creed. Young recruits memorized slogans until they became instinct. Loyalty is our honor. Obedience is freedom. Discipline is purity. These were not just mottos, they were liturgies. In Himmler's philosophy, bureaucracy became a kind of religion, and he, its high priest. He preached that the state could be sacred if its servants were pure, and purity meant submission to hierarchy. Historians who study the surviving training manuals describe them as chillingly methodical. They read less like military instruction and more like catechisms of control. Each section defined virtue as efficiency, sin as hesitation. Himmler saw obedience not as weakness, but as the highest strength. To question authority was to rebel against nature itself. It was this spiritualization of submission that transformed the SS from an army into an institution of faith. Members were told they were chosen instruments of destiny, guardians of a world order built on discipline. What they did not realize was that this very faith stripped them of self. The more they obeyed, the less they existed. Himmler understood the psychological comfort of surrender. By convincing men that obedience was moral, he freed them from the burden of guilt. Every act, no matter how cruel, became an act of devotion. Scholars later called it the theology of bureaucracy, the belief that following orders could redeem the soul. In that belief lay the seed of disaster. Once morality was outsourced to authority, no boundary remained between duty and atrocity. The system no longer required monsters. It only required believers. The most haunting discovery in the archives is not the violence itself, but the language used to conceal it. Within Himmler's files, historians found endless documents written in calm, detached tones. Memos discussing special actions, final measures, or improvements of resettlement efficiency. Each phrase seems harmless until one realizes what it replaced. Bureaucracy had become a mask for horror, a way to turn reality into abstraction. Himmler understood the power of words. He replaced blood with ink, emotion with terminology. When officials signed forms authorizing unspeakable acts, they did not see themselves as executioners, but as administrators fulfilling a policy. The genius of the system was its ability to hide truth behind language so technical that even conscience could not recognize it. The office became a sanctuary for denial. Inside Himmler's headquarters, every order passed through layers of revision, stripping away human context until only numbers remained. Reports arrived in tables and graphs, clean and unthreatening. This was evil perfected through procedure, evil that wore the mask of documentation. The narrator's voice slows as the camera moves over a table of surviving papers, each stamped processed. Nothing in them screams or pleads, they whisper. The horror lies not in what they say, but in what they refuse to say. Historians still debate whether this concealment was deliberate or instinctive. But perhaps that distinction no longer matters. When a system learns to describe cruelty as efficiency, it no longer needs hatred to function. It only needs the quiet rhythm of pens scratching across paper, turning life into statistics and conscience into compliance. Inside Himmler's world, purity was not a moral idea, but a bureaucratic target. He surrounded himself with scholars and pseudoscientists who sought to transform ideology into data. They worked in sterile rooms lined with measuring instruments, charts, and genealogical tables. Men in lab coats examined photographs and documents with the same detachment as accountants auditing numbers. Historians describe these scenes as the most disturbing form of rational madness, science repurposed as superstition. Himmler believed he could perfect humanity through classification. He created offices that traced bloodlines, cataloged features, and organized marriage approvals as if love itself required a signature. Each form was another step toward what he called spiritual hygiene. His obsession was not violence, but the illusion of cleansing the world through administration. To him, purity could be achieved by organizing existence, by erasing complexity. The tragedy lies in how many educated minds followed him, believing they were contributing to knowledge rather than atrocity. The archives contain letters from professors thanking Himmler for funding research that disguised prejudice as science. In these letters, words like efficiency, order, and standardization appear repeatedly, each concealing what they truly meant: exclusion, domination, destruction. The camera lingers on one of these letters, the ink still dark after decades, the handwriting neat and formal. It is the handwriting of belief turned blind. Himmler had succeeded in creating not an army of killers, but an army of clerks, scientists, and dreamers who thought they were purifying the world. They had forgotten that purity without conscience becomes poison. Eyewitnesses who visited Himmler's office describe a space that mirrored the man himself. Immaculately ordered, almost unnervingly clean. Not a document out of place, not a pencil misaligned. The curtains were adjusted each morning to let in exactly the same angle of light. It was a world that reflected his inner conviction that control could erase imperfection. In this quiet sanctuary, Himmler reviewed endless reports, stamped decisions, and dictated notes in a soft, precise tone. Those who met him expected the fire of a fanatic, yet encountered the calm of a clerk. One observer called him a man who managed evil as if balancing a budget. It is in that calmness that his horror truly lives. He believed that decency could coexist with cruelty, so long as cruelty was performed without emotion. He saw himself not as a destroyer, but as a custodian of order. Historians analyzing his diaries found frequent phrases like necessary measure, moral duty, hard but righteous. These phrases reveal a chilling self-awareness. He knew the weight of his actions, but framed them as administrative burdens. It was not the language of a madman, but of a man who had made peace with rationalized inhumanity. The sound of the typewriter in that office was as lethal as any weapon. Each keystroke formalized decisions that would ripple through millions of lives. Yet within that silence, Himmler found serenity. To him, morality meant doing one's job perfectly, even when that job required the destruction of others. The historian's voice lowers, almost to a whisper, as the scene fades from the tidy office to the vast corridors of a system that obeyed its own paperwork more faithfully than it obeyed conscience. Psychologists studying Himmler's system coined a term to describe it: administrative distancing. It meant separating the act from the consequence so completely that empathy could no longer interfere. Himmler's subordinates did not see suffering. They saw categories. Each report reduced a person to an entry, a number, or a note. When everything becomes data, guilt disappears. Historians believe Himmler perfected this process to protect the consciences of his followers. He often spoke about the burden of duty, insisting that the hardest task is to remain decent while doing what must be done. The words sound moral until one realizes what they justified. In his logic, decency meant obedience, not compassion. To disobey was immoral, even if obedience caused harm. The paradox is devastating. Morality turned inward until it served only itself. Himmler's men were taught to see pity as weakness, hesitation as betrayal. Their humanity was replaced by efficiency. Over time, even language lost its meaning. The more reports they filed, the less they remembered that those reports described people. Evil had been automated by logic. The narrator describes the moment when Himmler read a statistical summary of an operation and remarked only on its precision, not its consequence. That indifference was not born of hatred, but of distance. It was the final triumph of bureaucracy. The ability to destroy without feeling. And in that triumph, we glimpse the most dangerous illusion of all. That one can remain morals inside an immoral system, as long as the paperwork is clean. The rustle of paper closes the scene, echoing like the faint heartbeat of a machine that no longer knows it is alive. Inside Himmler's empire, ritual was the heartbeat of power. Every ceremony, every oath, every gesture had to be executed with mathematical precision. The SS swore allegiance not just to a leader, but to a vision of order that demanded purity in action and uniformity in thought. Under candlelight, recruits repeated vows until the words ceased to mean anything. They became rhythm, not reflection. Historians describe these scenes as theater turned into doctrine. The participants stood in perfect formation, their faces expressionless, their movements synchronized like gears within a single machine. Each step, each salute, was another layer of conditioning. The ritual stripped individuality and replaced it with belonging. It created what psychologists later called sacred obedience, a belief that submission itself was holy. In Himmler's mind, ritual transformed violence into virtue. The killing of conscience became an act of devotion, carried out with the stillness of prayer. He viewed this discipline as the pinnacle of civilization, a victory of control over chaos. And so, in underground chambers and open courtyards, countless ceremonies unfolded, men pledging faith not to morality, but to method. They believed they were becoming something more than human, when in truth they were being trained to forget their humanity. Each ritual ended the same way. Silence, then the echo of boots against stone, a sound that blurred the line between worship and command. Evil no longer needed to justify itself. It only needed to perform itself correctly. The banality of those moments remains the most haunting lesson of the age. That the gravest crimes can wear the calm of reverence, and that obedience, when ritualized, becomes indistinguishable from faith. By 1942, the machine Himmler had designed no longer required his constant supervision. Orders traveled through layers of offices and departments, reaching distant corners of the regime with mechanical precision. He had created a system so efficient that it functioned without its architect. Historians describe this as the moment when bureaucracy achieved autonomy, when procedure began to generate obedience on its own. Clerks filled out forms without questioning purpose. Officers carried out tasks without seeking meaning. The structure itself provided justification. What began as ideology had become momentum. The files moved faster than conscience, and the machine no longer cared who turned its gears. In secret meetings, Himmler spoke of purity and destiny. But by then his words were irrelevant. The institution he built had replaced belief with habit. Even those who doubted continued to act, because stopping meant being crushed by the system they served. The genius and horror of Himmler's design was that it no longer needed him. Power had been delegated, fragmented, diffused. No single person felt responsible, yet everyone contributed. The moral vacuum was complete. When historians trace the chains of command, they find not tyrants, but administrators. Men who obeyed forms, schedules, and quotas. The paperwork flowed like a river no one could stop. And in that flow, human judgment drowned. The turning point of control was not marked by rebellion or collapse, but by perfection. Himmler had achieved his goal. An empire that governed itself, an evil so organized that it no longer required intention. The final irony was that even he, the master of order, would soon become trapped in the machinery he had built. To understand Himmler is to confront a terrifying possibility. That reason itself can become a tool of madness. In his speeches and letters, he spoke with calm conviction about morality, discipline, and duty. He believed that by removing emotion, he was elevating civilization. His words are chilling, not because they sound evil, but because they sound logical. Historians examining his personal notes find diagrams of society arranged like equations. Each decision justified by efficiency, each life reduced to function. To Himmler, rationality meant control, and control was the highest good. The danger of such thinking lies in its clarity. Once a man convinces himself that he serves logic, compassion becomes an obstacle. Himmler's genius was not emotional manipulation, but intellectual seduction. He made cruelty sound orderly, inevitable, even moral. His speeches framed destruction as progress, his reports as management. He was not irrational, he was methodical. That is why he remains such a haunting figure. Not a man of chaos, but of procedure. The narrator's voice slows, almost tender, as images of his handwritten memos appear on screen. Each line is clean, balanced, deliberate. The handwriting of a man certain of his righteousness. In that certainty lies the warning for every generation that follows. Rationality without conscience is not wisdom. It is precision without mercy. Himmler's mirror reflects not a monster, but a principle. The idea that anything can be justified if it fits the system. The historian closes one of his ledgers and whispers, "He believed he was saving civilization." The echo lingers, and the camera fades to the cold glow of the archive, where the silence of logic still hums beneath the dust. The empire Himmler created was not built from castles or armies, but from files, hierarchies, and offices that stretched like a nervous system across a continent. Historians who have reconstructed his system describe it as a pyramid turned inside out. Its strength came from invisibility. Each branch of the machine knew only its immediate purpose, never the full design. Orders passed through coded channels, their origins blurred by layers of signatures. What appeared to be chaos from the outside was, in reality, a meticulously engineered labyrinth. Himmler believed that power should be diffused but traceable, faceless yet absolute. He had no need for shouting or spectacle. His authority was printed on stationery and sealed with stamps. Within his structure, even the smallest act of obedience reinforced the illusion of control. Subordinates feared not punishment, but omission, the possibility of being excluded from the flow of information. The architecture of power became a form of devotion. Each department, each desk, was a shrine to efficiency. Modern scholars call it one of the earliest examples of administrative totalitarianism, the belief that perfect organization could replace politics itself. What made it unstoppable was that it offered safety. The clerks who filed reports and the officers who enforced regulations all believed they were preserving order, protecting civilization from disorder. The system fed on that illusion until no one could distinguish necessity from moral surrender. And at its center sat a man who considered himself not a tyrant, but a custodian of structure, convinced that if the world could be made orderly enough, its sins would disappear. By the later years of the war, when defeat loomed on the horizon, Himmler still spoke of duty as if it were salvation. His speeches to his subordinates were filled with phrases like moral strength, honor, and sacrifice, all wrapped around the same word: obedience. Historians who have read those transcripts note how seamlessly he merged morality with submission. To Himmler, duty was no longer a choice, it was identity. Those who obeyed were righteous simply by obeying. Even as the empire fractured, he demanded from his officers the same calm precision, the same faith in discipline. There were no grand appeals to passion, only instructions to remain decent while fulfilling one's role. The tragedy of his vision is that decency had lost its meaning. The same men who once believed they were defending civilization were now preserving a collapsing illusion. Himmler's final addresses reveal not the voice of a zealot, but of an accountant closing his books. He spoke of moral burdens and historical necessity as though he were balancing equations. The words echo like a confession disguised as order. Scholars see in this language the final stage of bureaucratic belief, the point where loyalty to principle becomes loyalty to the structure itself. Even when the war turned against him, Himmler believed that to disobey would be the greater sin. He had built a religion around the word duty, and by the end, it was the only faith he had left. The narrator pauses as the sound of marching fades into static, the rhythm of obedience dissolving into silence. Duty, once his strength, had become his blindness. As the war drew to its final years, the machine began to break. The structure that had once appeared indestructible now trembled under its own weight. Communication lines failed, records vanished, commands contradicted one another. Yet even as the walls closed in, Himmler continued to insist on paperwork, meetings, and procedure. Historians describe him during this period as a man rearranging files while the world around him burned. His obsession with order had turned into ritual denial. He still demanded punctuality at briefings, still corrected grammar in reports. It was as if maintaining form could preserve meaning. But beneath the surface, fear spread through the ranks. Officers who once repeated his doctrines now hesitated. Clerks shredded documents faster than they could be stamped. The perfection he built was unraveling, not because of rebellion, but because of exhaustion. A system designed to eliminate error could not survive uncertainty. Himmler's memoranda from this time reveal a growing desperation, filled with words like stability, discipline, faith. The empire of control had become a prison of routine. Even as defeat became undeniable, he refused to face it directly. Instead, he clung to the illusion that order could outlast reality. The narrator's voice deepens as the camera moves through abandoned offices, papers scattered like snow, ink bleeding into dust. The files that once defined power now lie meaningless. The cracks in the system are not just structural, they are human. The men who once believed in obedience now face the truth that the system had never believed in them. And at the center of the ruin sits Himmler, staring at the fragments of his creation, still convinced that if he could organize them again, the world might yet make sense. By the winter of 1944, the empire that once obeyed Himmler's every command was collapsing around him. Yet what haunted him most was not defeat, but disorder. Witnesses recall his growing obsession with maintaining appearances even as chaos devoured the regime. He ordered reports to be filed, uniforms pressed, and meetings to proceed on schedule while cities turned to rubble. To Himmler, a wrinkled report was a sign of moral decay, a crooked line on a page more intolerable than human suffering. Historians who studied his final communications describe a tone that borders on delusion. He spoke of restoring efficiency, of preserving structure, as if the ruins of Europe could be repaired by administrative precision. The man who once commanded millions now spent his days correcting margins on documents and redrawing organizational charts no one would ever read. His authority had become a ritual performance, an attempt to convince himself that order still existed. This was not madness in the traditional sense. It was the logical consequence of a life built on control. He could not imagine a world that functioned without his rules, and so he continued to enforce them even as they turned to ash. Those closest to him described his expression in these final months as calm, almost serene. It was the serenity of denial, the peace of a man who refused to see what he had created. The empire was dying, yet Himmler still believed it could be organized back to life. The true tragedy was that he could not distinguish between structure and salvation. The collapse of his system was not just political, it was personal. Without order, he was nothing. And so, surrounded by the noise of a crumbling world, he listened only for the sound of his own rules, echoing faintly through the silence. In the final months of the war, as defeat became undeniable, Himmler sought refuge not in power, but in negotiation. He imagined that his bureaucratic skill could still be bartered for peace. Historians describe this as his last delusion, the belief that procedure could redeem catastrophe. He attempted to present himself to foreign diplomats as a man of reason, distancing his identity from the crimes his system had carried out. But the paper shield he trusted so deeply no longer held weight. His documents, once symbols of control, had become evidence. Every signature, every memo, every line of administrative clarity was now an indictment. Yet even as he fled, Himmler remained a prisoner of his own logic. He carried files in his briefcase, as though bureaucracy might protect him from the chaos he had unleashed. Those who saw him during these days spoke of a man who appeared exhausted yet composed, clinging to the mannerisms of authority long after authority had vanished. He continued to speak of order, of future reconstruction, of the need to maintain discipline. The delusion was total. The very faith that had given his life meaning, faith in obedience, hierarchy, and structure, had become meaningless. When he finally realized that his own subordinates no longer followed his commands, he experienced not rage, but confusion. The system that had once obeyed him perfectly had dissolved into self-preservation. The bureaucrat who had made obedience a religion was now abandoned by his own worshippers. The collapse of faith was complete. It was not merely the failure of a man, but the implosion of an idea. That control could save humanity from itself. The briefcase full of documents he carried into hiding was not a record of power, but a record of belief turned to dust. April 1945. The cities he once governed lay in ruins, and the empire he built existed only on paper. Himmler disguised himself, traveling through the remnants of his own creation under a false name. Yet even in hiding, he carried identification cards and permits, fragments of a world he could not let go. Historians reconstructing his final days describe a man still living inside the architecture of rules, still bowing to procedure. When captured by Allied forces, he introduced himself calmly, politely, as if attending another meeting. He requested that his captors verify his identity through official channels. The irony was unbearable. The master of secrecy undone by the very system of verification he had perfected, when the realization came that he would stand trial. Himmler chose to escape through the one act that required no authorization. He ended his life in silence, leaving behind no confession, only paperwork. His death was as methodical as his life, planned, organized, executed without emotion. Scholars have debated whether this final act was cowardice or consistency, but perhaps it was both. The man who built an empire of obedience could not imagine submitting himself to judgment. His final gesture was an administrative closure, a way to file himself out of existence. The historian's voice softens as the scene returns to the archive. There, under dim light, lie the remains of his world. Folders, memos, and reports stamped with his initials. Each page a fragment of a vast illusion. The belief that order could purify chaos, that discipline could replace morality. The files are silent now, yet they speak of a truth far beyond one man's fate. Power born of obedience dies the same way it lived. Quietly, efficiently, without question. When the war ended and the noise of collapse faded, investigators entered Himmler's abandoned offices. The air inside was still, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Desks stood neatly arranged, typewriters covered with dust, drawers filled with labeled folders that led nowhere. Each document bore traces of his obsession with order. Clean margins, uniform ink, meticulous signatures. Yet beneath that precision lay the wreckage of an entire world. Historians who sifted through the papers found no outbursts, no moments of remorse, only continuity. Even in the final weeks, reports had been filed with punctuality, approvals stamped with calm regularity. It was as if the system itself had continued working after its master's disappearance, performing its routines out of habit. One archivist later wrote that entering Himmler's office felt like discovering a machine that had died mid-motion. The files spoke without emotion, their language still coded in the euphemisms of efficiency. Reassignment, final measure, completed. The moral weight of those words was invisible to the clerks who had written them. But to the historians who read them decades later, they were unbearable. Among the papers lay a note written in pencil. "We have done our duty." No name, no date, no context. Just that single sentence, a farewell from an age that mistook procedure for morality. The silence in that room was heavier than any confession. It was the silence of logic after its consequences have been revealed. The camera lingers on a single sheet of paper trembling under the breath of an open window. Outside, the world has moved on. Inside, the ghost of bureaucracy remains, whispering the most dangerous lie ever told. That duty can exist without humanity. In the years after the war, trials and testimonies revealed a haunting pattern. The men and women who had served under Himmler rarely saw themselves as perpetrators. They described themselves as secretaries, typists, organizers, each convinced their role was too small to carry guilt. "We never saw the results," one of them said. "We only handled the files." Historians call this the fragmentation of conscience, the way moral responsibility dissolves when divided among many hands. The clerks who managed logistics, the officers who stamped authorizations, all insisted they were obeying orders. In their eyes, the system had no villains, only procedures. This collective blindness became one of the most disturbing lessons of the 20th century. Evil had not required monsters, it had required functionaries. The courtroom transcripts show no rage, no ideology, only justification. They spoke of deadlines, budgets, efficiency, as though the crimes were mere administrative errors. It was not hatred that sustained the system, but obedience wrapped in professionalism. Psychologists who studied them later found that many expressed pride in their precision, even after learning the consequences of their work. To them, morality had been replaced by performance. They were not cruel, they were thorough. The horror lies in that distinction. The narrator's voice slows as the camera moves over stacks of typed pages, each line a fragment of complicity. The clerks of conscience remind us that responsibility cannot be delegated to hierarchy. When obedience becomes virtue, humanity becomes optional. The files they once guarded are now exhibits in museums, silent witnesses to a truth too familiar to forget. The handwriting is neat, the grammar perfect, and between the lines, the soul of a century disappears. In the decades that followed, scientists and philosophers tried to understand how an entire society could obey so completely. They studied the nature of authority, the fragility of conscience, the human instinct to conform. The experiments of Stanley Milgram and Philip Zimbardo became mirrors held up to the past. Volunteers, ordinary citizens, followed instructions that inflicted pain because someone in a lab coat told them to. The results were devastatingly clear. The capacity for cruelty was not rare. It was human. Historians drew a straight line between those experiments and Himmler's empire of obedience. What he had built was not an anomaly, but an amplification of something inherent in civilization itself. The desire for order, even at the cost of empathy. Psychologists called it the banality of obedience, a term that captured how evil could become procedural. The lesson was not confined to history. It applied to every institution that prizes hierarchy over morality. In offices, corporations, even governments, the echo of Himmler's system still lingers wherever responsibility is replaced by instruction. The narrator's tone softens, not in forgiveness, but in warning. The danger, he says, is not that people enjoy cruelty, but that they fear disobedience. The footage shifts to modern streets, to crowds moving in unison, to factories and offices humming with order. The past and present blur. The question is no longer how Himmler's system was possible, but how easily it could return. Every generation must decide whether it values justice more than structure, compassion more than compliance. The psychologists revealed what history already knew: that the line between morality and obedience is thinner than anyone dares to admit, and once it fades, the world repeats itself with frightening precision. When the survivors began to speak, the world learned what bureaucracy had tried to erase. Their words were not just recollections of pain. They were indictments against the silence of administration. Many of them had never seen Himmler, never heard his voice. Yet they lived within the shadow of his decisions. They described numbers on forms that became their identities, trains that followed timetables more faithfully than mercy, and guards who carried out duties without hatred, only precision. Historians say that their testimonies rehumanized what Himmler's paperwork had dehumanized. Each sentence spoken in trembling voice rebuilt a life that the system had reduced to a statistic. One survivor recalled watching an officer check a list before turning away without a word. "He did not look cruel," she said. "He looked tired." That sentence, simple yet shattering, exposed the nature of bureaucratic evil. It functions best when performed without feeling. The trials that followed forced nations to confront a truth more painful than guilt itself: that ordinary people, under ordinary orders, can sustain extraordinary cruelty. In the courtroom, the survivors did not cry out for vengeance. They demanded recognition. Their testimonies became the moral counterweight to the cold logic that had governed their suffering. Every document Himmler had signed found its answer in a voice that refused to be silenced. The camera lingers on black and white footage of faces aged by memory, lips trembling as they form words that should never have needed to exist. Against the hum of archival film, the narrator's voice falls to a whisper. "No file can contain this," he says. "No report can measure what was lost." In the end, the survivors taught the world that remembrance itself is an act of defiance, and that the only weapon strong enough to break bureaucracy is the human voice. Decades later, deep in a climate-controlled vault, a historian opened one of Himmler's remaining ledgers. The air smelled of dust and age, the silence heavy as stone. On the final page, beneath neat columns of figures and initials, she found a small handwritten note in pencil. All procedures finalized. The words were ordinary, administrative, harmless at first glance. But as she read them again, their weight became unbearable. Here, at the end of 1,000 pages of calculation, bureaucracy had written its own epitaph. The historian placed her hand over the words and felt the chill of history itself. That brief sentence contained everything: the precision, the detachment, the illusion of completion. All procedures finalized. It was the closing phrase of an empire built on obedience. No emotion, no acknowledgement, only closure. When the historian later spoke about that moment, she said she did not cry. She felt a strange stillness, as if the page itself were holding its breath. It was not the handwriting of a monster, but of a man doing his job. That was what made it terrifying. In that moment, the historian understood what Hannah Arendt had called the banality of evil. Not chaos or rage, but paperwork ending in full stops. The ledger now rests in a museum, sealed in glass, its ink slowly fading under filtered light. Visitors stand before it in silence, reading the words that turned morality into record-keeping. Some say the page feels colder than metal, as if it still carries the residue of obedience. The archivist's discovery was not a revelation about the past, but a warning for the future. The phrase, "all procedures finalized," is not just history. It is a reminder of how easily a civilization can mistake completion for justice. In the decades that followed, philosophers, theologians, and jurists wrestled with the question Himmler left behind. Can a person be guilty if they believe they are only obeying? The debates filled universities and courtrooms, shaping the moral vocabulary of the modern world. The conclusion was never simple. Responsibility, they argued, cannot be dissolved by hierarchy. To follow orders is not to surrender conscience. The historian's voice deepens as the camera shows modern offices, fluorescent lights flickering over computers and paperwork. The faint echo of the same system reborn in subtler forms. Himmler's legacy was not confined to history. It had infiltrated the structure of modern life. Every protocol, every chain of command, carries within it the same temptation: to replace moral judgment with procedure. The philosopher Karl Jaspers once wrote that guilt is not only personal, but civic, that societies share the burden of what they permit in silence. The lesson of Himmler is not that one man was evil, but that millions accepted his framework without question. Historians studying his private correspondence note his certainty, his conviction that he was doing what had to be done. He never saw himself as cruel. That is why his story endures, not as a warning about extremism, but about normality. The philosophy of responsibility demands that we look inward, that we ask whether obedience excuses harm, whether structure absolves conscience. The narrator's voice quiets as the image fades to the reflection of a single lamp on a stack of modern documents. The world has changed, but the pattern remains. The moral of this story is not confined to the past. It whispers to every generation that follows. Responsibility begins where obedience ends. Part 28, The Weight of the Pen. The historian's voice returns to the image of a pen resting on a desk. It is the simplest object in the room, yet it holds the greatest power. In Himmler's world, A single stroke of ink could decide destinies. The pen was his weapon, quiet and absolute. It never trembled, never questioned, never bled. Historians who studied his handwriting noticed its steadiness, the absence of emotion in every line. There is something haunting in that calmness, the serenity of conviction without reflection. Each document he signed was a transaction between belief and bureaucracy, a contract between logic and moral void. What frightens us is not the violence of his words, but their normality. The language of evil does not scream. It speaks in complete sentences and balanced margins. The narrator reflects that civilization's greatest danger lies not in chaos, but in administration. Every empire of cruelty begins with a person convinced that efficiency is virtue. The pen becomes a symbol of distance, a tool that allows destruction to feel abstract. In museums today, visitors see the same fountain pen encased in glass, its ink dried long ago, and wonder how such a small object could rewrite the boundaries of morality. The answer is unsettling. Tools are innocent until wielded by certainty. Himmler believed in the sanctity of control. To him, every order was a necessity, every decision an act of stewardship. He died believing he had served order itself. The weight of the pen, light in the hand but heavy in consequence, remains the perfect metaphor for bureaucratic evil, a reminder that civilization can destroy with grace and that the soft sound of writing can echo louder than any gunfire. The story of Himmler is not about one man, but about what humanity becomes when structure eclipses conscience. The historian speaks over footage of cities today. Crowds crossing streets, offices filled with data, the rhythm of modern life pulsing with order. It is easy to believe that we have learned, that history's machinery has been dismantled. Yet the mirror does not flatter. It reflects patterns that remain. Every time a form replaces a face, every time efficiency outranks empathy, a small part of that machinery breathes again. Himmler's legacy is not confined to the past. It survives wherever people obey systems without asking who they serve. Historians argue that modern civilization thrives on the same logic he perfected, the worship of function over meaning. In our world of algorithms, policies, and automation, the same question arises. Can progress exist without conscience? The narrator's voice lowers, resonant and deliberate. The danger, he says, is not the return of tyranny, but the survival of its logic. The mirror of humanity reveals that what was once ideology has become infrastructure. We no longer need belief to obey. The system is belief enough. Himmler's name may fade into history, but the impulse he embodied, our hunger for order, our fear of chaos, remains timeless. The lesson is not to reject organization, but to remember that structure without soul becomes its own god. The camera pans to a reflection in glass. The historian standing before rows of archives, his image doubled in the polished surface. In that reflection, past and present coexist, and the unspoken realization lingers. What we condemn in history, we often repeat in silence. Night falls over the archive once more. The historian closes the final folder, the light above his desk dimming to a faint glow. The pages rustle like dying breath, their ink whispering what language cannot. Every age, he says softly, creates its own Himmlers, the ones who believe that efficiency can purify the world. The camera lingers on the emptiness of the room, shelves lined with silence, a single clock ticking in the distance. Power has dissolved, the system is gone, yet its logic endures. It hides within our institutions, our offices, our habits of obedience. The bureaucrat's shadow is not the ghost of one man. It is the reflection of a civilization that mistakes order for virtue. The historian looks out the window where city lights flicker like the faint pulse of a restless conscience. Evil, he continues, rarely arrives shouting. It walks in wearing a badge, carrying documents, asking for your signature. The scene fades to the soft hum of an air vent, the breath of a building that holds too many memories. A beam of light cuts across the floor, illuminating the desk where the pen still lies, a symbol of authority, a relic of belief. The narrator's tone lowers to a near whisper. Power fades, systems crumble, but the desire to control remains eternal. The lesson of Himmler is not about the past. It is about the present and the silence that allows it to return. The final shot rests on the pen's reflection, trembling under the light as if alive. Then darkness. The hum stops. Only the echo of the historian's final words remains. Evil never dies, it reorganizes.